Now, President Donald Trump announced today in Miami that he will be reversing President Obama's policies regarding Cuba. Now, specifically, travel and trade with the island nation. Now, during a speech, Donald Trump had said, "A free Cuba is what we will soon achieve." A free Cuba. So how does he actually plan to do that? Well, from what I could read originally, at first anyway, looking at the story and hearing the announcement, my guess is that he was going to go back to doing what we did for the last, I don't know, half a century, which didn't work. Basically go back to banning travel and doing an embargo against Cuba. That's not necessarily what he's going to do, and I'll give you the details. But first, I do want to give you a quote. He says, "We now hold the cards. The previous administration's easing of restrictions on travel and trade does not help the Cuban people. They only enrich the regime." He also said that President Obama's deal was, quote, "completely one-sided." Not necessarily, but okay. Now, what changes is he making? Well, the Huffington Post explains that the new policy will again limit U.S. tourism to Cuba, which has boomed since Obama thawed relations with the island nation's authoritarian communist regime in 2014. Now, American tourists have been able to travel to the country on their own via what's known as individual people-to-people educational trip. Now, ironically, this is a supposedly communist nation. Airlines have capitalized on this by offering direct flights to Cuba. So, again, you can't escape capitalism. You can't escape American capitalism, okay? Even in Cuba. Now, they can no longer do that in the same way. They can still do that, but they will now have to qualify for a visa under one of 12 authorized travel categories, which will be more intensely enforced. Now, these educational trips qualify under one of those categories. However, now they must be part of a guide-led group trip. So, like an educational trip, like I said. Now, Cuban-Americans, however, will still be allowed to visit family members in Cuba, so there's really no change there. Now, the new regulations also prevent the U.S. citizens from conducting financial transactions with companies controlled by the Cuban military or intelligence services. Now, those companies happen to make up a large percentage of the Cuban economy, and President Trump says, no, we're not going to allow you to spend money there. We're not going to help the Cuban regime. You know why? Because sad. That's why. In addition to preventing U.S. businesses from dealing with state-controlled companies, the new regulation will also prevent Americans from staying in state-owned hotels, shopping at major retail chains, or even using particular tourist services on the island. So, if you do happen to go to Cuba, whether it be, you're visiting family as a Cuban, somebody who's a Cuban expat, a Cuban-American, or I don't know, you're one of these groups, well, Donald Trump just eliminated your ability to do business with most of the Cuban economy. Sad. So apparently you can't do a whole lot of things if you're even able to go to the island. I mean, I understand the rationale behind it, but the thing is, what's the point? What's the point of even going to Cuba if you can't really do anything? Now, there is some good news in this. Trump, according to the Huffington Post, will not break off U.S. diplomatic ties or cancel the embassy Obama reopened in 2015. So we're not doing a complete rollback of everything of the progress that we had made in normalizing relations with Cuba, although this is a step back. The new restrictions also will not bar, and I think some of you will be very happy for this, the restrictions will not bar U.S. visitors from bringing home Cuban rum and cigars. So, hey, man, any of you who likes those Cuban cigars, good news for you. You can still get them. All right. Now, also good for business, American business anyway. They will also not bar airlines or cruise companies from offering service to the island. So you can still go there for a cruise. You can still go there through your airline. Now, also banking transactions will still be allowed, letting some U.S. visitors continue to book accommodations via Airbnb or other private property rental platforms. So look, all the regulations that I've read so far, I'm a little mixed on this, okay? Like, it doesn't seem bad as what it could have been. I mean, it kind of makes me ask, well, what was the point? And what was the point of just doing these reforms? You know, does he realize that even if you're spending money in Cuba at a privately owned business, some of that money still ends up in the pockets of the Cuban government? Maybe not directly, because you're no longer able to do business with government-owned Cuban businesses, right? So, again, what's the point of this entire thing? And yes, before you say, no, Cuba's they're communists, they don't have small business. Actually, that's not true. In 2008, Raul Castro legalized small and medium-sized private businesses. So I get that this ruling, when you know that, when you realize that, this ruling, I think, is intended to draw people towards those small and medium-sized businesses. But for me, it's like, why not just let people spend their money where they want to spend? If they want to go to a private business, great. That's capitalism. Ironically, right? You're letting people have a choice. Donald Trump is saying, no, I don't want you to have the choice because maybe you'll choose the government hotel instead of some private Airbnb. Well, how dare you be comfortable and actually go to a government-owned hotel? So, again, I see what they're attempting to do, what they're trying to do, but I think if you want Cuba to be more open, just let us continue to normalize relations. Once we started doing that, for example, thanks to Obama and thanks to Raul Castro, ironically, for allowing these private businesses to spring up, even if most of the economy is still controlled by the government, well, you know, look, things started to get better, okay, for Cubans and for American tourists. I mean, again, their tourism industry, which is an industry, is booming, thanks to Americans who are curious and wanted to go over and see what it's like in Cuba. So my whole point is, though, is that these rollbacks don't seem to be all that necessary. So it makes me ask, well, why? Why? What's the point? What's the point? And is he trying to score points with the Cuban-American population in Florida? Likely. And that's probably a part of it. And the other part is, I think, personally, Obama. What does it always come down to when Donald Trump targets an Obama-era policy? Well, it's about eliminating anything that President Obama had actually done. In fact, during his campaign, he promised to do just this. All the concessions that Barack Obama had granted the Castro regime were done with executive order, which means the next president can reverse them, and that is what I will do unless the Castro regime meets our demands. Those demands will include religious and political freedom for the Cuban people and the freeing of political prisoners. So, look, I get, again, if he really wanted to do that, okay, those are admirable goals. Unfortunately, you don't seem to get a whole lot from extortion, again, as evidence of 50 years of us banning relations, of 50 years of an embargo. That hasn't worked. We know that hasn't worked. That's why we started to change course to try to normalize relations again. These steps, while not huge, it's a little bit of a step back on that. So I think since it's not going to really make that big of an impact, it will impact, of course, people who want to actually go to Cuba and spend money. But again, the impact, I think, is going to be fairly negligible on this. But what it is, in my opinion, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's more of like, hey, my approval rating's in the toilet. I'm gonna reverse something Obama did and maybe get the support of Republicans in Florida, Cuban-Americans, which do vote for Republicans far more than they do for Democrats. So I don't really think it's so much of combating the, you know, authoritarian regime in Cuba and helping the Cuban people. It's more of like, hey, I'm going to distract you. I'm going to distract you and maybe score some brownie points by getting rid of something that Obama had put into place. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.